Let's bring in our political editor, Andrew Clennell, now for more on this. But I want to start, Andrew, this afternoon with this discussion moving away from the economics to the public health question. Will there or won't there be a ban on mass gatherings? And what's happening in terms of the sports and government? Are they in discussions on that?
Well, they are, Kieran, and they're in discussions pretty regularly is what I'm being told. So Chief Medical Officers are considering the possibility of urging the cancellation of major events in the weeks ahead if the virus gets worse, and the possibility of virtual sporting events like we saw in Vietnam last night with the Australian women's soccer team playing to an empty stadium in a World Cup qualifier. Sources have told me that as of last night, because there were 77 cases, there are 77 cases in New South Wales, 44% were people from overseas, 42% transmission on shore, that this has changed the conversation on this one now that it's about a 50-50 split. So I guess we're looking at things like AFL and NRL matches to empty stadiums if things get worse. The NRL round starts tonight, so it's not something that's being looked at directly at the moment, but there's talk about a phone hook-up between the codes the next few days just to discuss the issue. And NRL sources have said to me they'll do whatever the government says they should do. Cricket sources say they feel they've dodged a bullet with the T20 women's final last weekend because it could have been a more tricky decision in a couple of weeks' time. A federal government source says at this point the advice is public gatherings are fine, that's a medical advice, but if that changes, the Chief Medical Officer will tell the Australian people, and that the government is not there at the moment but has been planning for all scenarios. A New South Wales government source has told me there's a clear watching brief over the possibility of moving on major events now, given that it appears the disease is spreading, as it is in other countries, by human-to-human transmission. No doubt this will be a topic at the COAG meeting in Sydney tomorrow. Let's listen to what Gladys Berejiklian, the New South Wales Premier, said about the monitoring of public gatherings at a press briefing this morning.
There is no need to panic. There's no need to massively change what you're doing, but it's not business as usual. We are asking everybody to take extra precautions. We're asking everybody to consider how they move around, and as the Chief Medical Officer will explain, some of those 77 cases have yet to trace the source of where they contracted the virus, and for that reason, New South Wales will continue to review all of our policies in relation to mass gatherings and where there's large numbers of people congregating.
Andrew, the Prime Minister was asked about this issue. He says his approach is he's following the public health advice and he still plans to go to the rugby league this weekend.
Interesting comment that he made. I'm going to see his beloved Sharks. Having said that, even with the stimulus, we heard him say at the outset it was modest and then substantial significance. So he's shown on this crisis an ability to change position. I think that's a reassurance for this weekend, maybe not in future weeks if the virus cases increase. Let's listen to what the Prime Minister said on the matter.
Well, it's very simple. You follow the health advice. I'm going to the footy this weekend. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm sure many Australians would, and I encourage you to, unless you're ill, and unless there's a reason. There have been no suggestions from those body of health advisors for that to occur at this point. Now, we can't know the future. And if at some point in the future the health advice were to change, then I'm sure they'd give that advice.
So no change for the moment, Andrew. The person raising the most concern about this approach from the major parties is the former Labor leader Bill Shorten today.
Yes, and I think Bill Shorten was saying that he's basing this on the experience of other countries. Obviously, Italy in full lockdown, a lot worse position than us. But Britain too are taking some steps. I think there's been reports of EPL matches being called off and some social distancing about to take place. And of course, today we had a player from the Utah Jazz test positive and the NBA season suspended in America. That's not to mention Donald Trump's travel ban on European travel. So it's really moving quite quickly around the world. Let's have a listen to Bill Shorten on Sky this morning.
The only way to make sure this pandemic is not worse than it otherwise could be is to have more drastic social distancing measures. Singapore and Japan and parts of China, they are putting in more draconian reactions. As a result, it would appear that some of their pandemic numbers are not going to be as bad as other countries who are just doing too little too late. This is going to be a major policy question, not in weeks and months, but in days. Do we keep having big events? Will we teach school from home? We've got to have more social distancing, and that is the only way to stop this pandemic being worse than it might otherwise be.
Bill Shorten says we've got a couple of days to deal with it. He's going to be joining us at 4:20 Eastern Daylight Time as well for more on that issue. He feels very strongly about it, Andrew. Let's go back to the economic situation, though, and this stimulus. Is it enough to keep Australia out of recession? That was certainly the thing I asked the Prime Minister. What's your take on it, Andrew?
Well, you'd have to think the advice is it is, because 1.5% of GDP they're hoping to put in the economy. We reported the comments by Martin Parkinson, the former Treasury Secretary, yesterday, where he said you needed at least 0.5% of GDP. Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg have gone for 1.5%. When Kevin Rudd, with his first stimulus, all the $900 cheques, he went for 0.88% of GDP. So they've really gone for it here. Let's hear what Scott Morrison said to you. He certainly didn't rule out the prospect of a recession. Put it that way. Let's listen.
Will this package be enough to save the nation from recession?
We have worked carefully, Kieran, to make sure that we have got a proportionate response here to meet the challenge. Now, this is, as I said, 1.2% of GDP. To give you some comparison, when the initial stimulus was done for the GFC many years ago, those payments equated to some 0.88% of GDP. This is, I think, a key difference, is that we understand that for the Australian economy to continue to move forward, businesses need to continue to go forward and do what they do each day.
The PM there at his news conference earlier in the day. He's also going to be making an address to the nation at 7:00 Eastern Daylight Time. It follows our lengthy discussion on that very idea on Sunday agenda with Nikki Sava. It was her idea originally, and obviously something we discussed at length as well, Andrew.
Yes, and I guess we hope that apart from the economic side of things with that address, it's the first since Kevin Rudd during the GFC with his stimulus, that there's a real health component and telling Australians how to go about their lives with this health crisis upon us. About 4 or 5 minutes that address will be, so it'll certainly be worth watching. In terms of what was promised here, the $17 billion, we flagged 15 to 20 yesterday. It's interesting that the $4.8 billion are these cash payments, $750 to families earning less than $100,000, pensioners and New Start recipients. And it's reflective of what Ken Henry, the former Treasury Secretary, said to Kevin Rudd: go hard, go early, go households. He certainly has here. The other interesting aspect about the $17 billion figure, not all of which is this financial year, but a large part, and the $4.8 billion figure, is if you look at the surpluses they projected in December in the mid-year economic outlook, $5 billion for 1920, wiped in one day with that cash payment, $6.1 billion for 2021, good luck hanging on to that, $8.4 billion for 21-22. I guess they'll be looking budget day to try and get that back in the black, because there's not much spending in here in 21-22. Only $4 billion they projected for 22-23. Might be a while before those back in black mugs can be used with proper spirit, Kieran.